and again, welcome. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that Royal Roads University rests upon the ancestral lands of the Kosamsam and Lekwungen nations. I'm speaking today from the Lekwungen Nation territory, and I invite each of you to think about the land on which you're living and working at the moment and acknowledge the original people of that territory. In this first completely remote Roads to Research, we're delighted to welcome Dr. Jennifer Walinga, Professor and Program Head in RRU's School of Communication and Culture. Her presentation is Winning Better, Cases of Cultural Transformation in Sport and Coaching. As I mentioned earlier, we're recording this presentation for social media, but we'll have some time at the end where we'll stop the recording. And if you want to share your screen at that time, you can to ask any questions, or you can use the chat or email research services like it says on the slide there. And finally, we thank the Canadian Tri-Agency Research Support Fund for their support of these events. I think that covers everything. Jennifer, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Vanessa. It's just great to see everybody, and isn't it wonderful that we have this technology? Aren't we lucky? Actually, before I share, I'll just talk a little bit and say hi. I'm still seeing some people join, and it's really great to see so many friends from Royal Roads joining in, and I think we've got a few people from outside of our school walls who are venturing in and exploring what we have to offer here. Really wanted to thank the team in the research office because, you know, they are just an incredible team of people who live our values here at Royal Roads so beautifully. They're so supportive, and they always can help you solve problems, and incredibly good coaches for us as well, which ties in definitely with my presentation. I wanted to acknowledge them. So welcome to my presentation. This is a synopsis of so many different things I've been working on over the many years, but especially in the last couple of years, this has really taken off in all directions, and it's been wonderful to be able to have a little bit of extra time to focus on this kind of research. And I find that it has found me in many ways. I think I was very much spending my time in the world of organizational development, leadership development, communication, problem solving within organizations and groups and teams. And of course, I have a background in sport, and it just kept kind of calling me, and more as I got more involved in sport with my own kids and the community, and then sitting on boards and returning to that kind of world, I found it just drawing me in more and more. And I think it's been a lovely little circle of moving from that naive simplicity into the profound simplicity stage of the later years of my career as well. And I always like to start by acknowledging the lands that our fine university rests on, but also on highlighting what the lands have to teach us, what our history has to teach us, of course, and in putting more effort into acknowledging the gaps in our history and the errors to strive to heal those cracks in our culture in Canada, but also really do a better job of learning from our environment. And I think I'm so privileged to work at Royal Roads because we constantly look out at this beautiful old growth forest, and we invite our students to venture into down the trails and along the water and look out toward the mountains and just learn, pay attention. And I think every time we've ever held any kind of a design thinking session, we all tend to generate these models of ecosystems. I think it just really sits with us as a core for our learning at Royal Roads. As a learning organization, we're constantly looking out to those systems that surround us. And aren't we fortunate to be on these grounds at all times? You know, literally, we are surrounded by other artifacts like bridges. We use this bridge as a real metaphor in our school, the idea of bridging, minding those gaps, getting to know the differences between us and among us, and then bridging those gaps and building shared understanding is the key function of communication. We're surrounded by beautiful gardens that we that make us take pause, right? And literally smell the roses as you walk through this garden on your way to your next meeting or your next endeavor. We're so lucky to be working with our students who are leaders, who are developing leaders and trying to enhance our world and foster positive change and really look after the planet that we all rest on, right, together and in a collaborative manner. I love our teaching model for the ways that we embody action research and experiential learning and this idea of venturing out into nature to learn from Mother Nature and what it has to teach us. We also, I'm proud to say, are partnered with a sport organization called Game Plan, where we invite athletes into our programs because it's a very natural fit. These are people who've been devoting 10 or 15 years of their lives to high performance environments and pursuits. They've learned a tremendous amount, and through flexible admission, some of them can come in and acknowledge all that learning through their international training and competition. For credit, like any other flexible learner does, resting on their professional experience, right? And they bring so much learning into our cohorts and into our learning communities. So I act as a liaison for these athletes. This is one of our first athletes that we worked with using this umbrella partnership. Andrea Burke, she took our MA in leadership, and I supervised her project. So I think of sport as a wonderful metaphor, a real incubator of life learning that can help us understand how to function more effectively in organizations. So I've experienced pushback on that as a consultant and also probably a keynote speaker. You know, people can sometimes struggle. Not everybody's an athlete, and we don't all identify with sport. But I think we do, actually, and I've pushed back myself on that and learned, again, over the many years I've been in this realm, that sport is a really wonderful metaphor for anybody. You know, we can participate in sports not just as athletes, but as spectators and as community members who may not participate in sport directly, but are akin to sport because it operates as a real driver in our society and contributes and can contribute in so many ways to our society. I think sport is a wonderful environment in which we can learn about leadership and systems, communication, how to manage our resources, this idea of strategy and strategic planning, collaboration. There are just so many opportunities to learn about learning and innovation as well. And we see the power of metaphor embodied in a lot of the writings in leadership and organizational development as well. We know that metaphors offer us a shared language that's distinct from the environment in which we operate. So it's a wonderful tool to be able to talk about something more objectively and outside of it and being free to really imagine it in new ways because we're thinking metaphorically and not necessarily as closely as when we're living it. And interestingly, sport is in crisis, you know, just like we're living through right now. And just as the world is facing crisis with climate change and political challenges, sport too has experienced its share of crisis, especially and increasingly over the last few years. Our participation rates are in decline, over 60% in the last 20 years. It's been tracked. And there are a number of factors contributing to that. Financial, of course, and the screen time and distraction, changing nature of how kids are operating these days, and increasing stress, and an increasing lack of support for, I would say, demographically, but also for sport programming. And much of that has to do with one of these factors that has stood out for us as researchers, which is that kids are dropping out because of changing attitudes. So the idea that there's too much emphasis on winning, they are turned off by the negative behaviors of coaches and parents, there's too much pressure, there's not enough fun. And we've seen this in organizations as well. We know that we can learn in a state of crisis, that crisis offers us so many opportunities to clarify what's crucial, what's important, to develop our systems, to repair cultural cracks. Crisis, as we can see with COVID, it reveals so many problems, but also opportunities to function more effectively in society. And we're seeing the same thing in sport. It's revealing for us where those cultural cracks really exist. And we see that this factor of the changing attitudes towards sport and the shift in mentality that we've been experiencing probably for the last, I'd say, 30 years, is leading to burnout and disengagement of these youth, right? They're dropping out at remarkable numbers. And that's having a huge cost, not just for sport, but for all the benefits sport can bring to society. And again, we see these same numbers and costs and factors reflected in the writings in organizational development literature, people like Kahn and Pink and Herzberg, Ducey and Ryan, around motivation, engagement, and the power and costs of disengagement. But unfortunately, sport really has suffered from this win-at-all-cost mentality, and increasingly so. I think it's probably a natural trajectory or pendulum swing, but we have a predominant culture right now that is about winning no matter what. There are a lot of factors probably contributing to that. I know in Canada we took on the own the podium mentality or approach to sport funding and sport development, sport direction, which I think unluckily, unfortunately, put medals as the focus and podium finishes as the focus, and we've seen some real fallout from that decision making. I think it was well intentioned, it was assertive and goal oriented and well-meaning, and I know the people who are behind it, but it has led us down an interesting path, revealing to us that maybe that isn't quite the right way, and we're having to make some corrections. But the win-at-all-cost mentality is everywhere. It's not just in Canada, and it shows up in different ways in terms of tolerating abuse or accepting abuse as something that leads to the development of grit. Toughens you up. We got to break you down in order to toughen you up, and that will lead to better performance. We don't know where this is coming from. Is it the fact that we've inherited sport from the Greeks where we were preparing people for war? Is it about desensitization in the face of really harsh challenges? That kind of works for war, but even with my the military friends and students I've worked with say that's really not the way it is anymore, that even combat training is moving away from this desensitization approach, that there are again too many costs associated with this kind of breaking down in order to build up. We realize that sure, it might desensitize someone for a little while and allow them to tolerate undue horrors that we would experience in a war situation. But the costs, as we can see, in terms of mental and physical trauma are inordinate and long-lasting and sometimes irrecoverable. There's also this idea or attitude that I definitely experienced through the 90s, which was that we have to win medals no matter what. Politically, it's a sign of status and superiority, and it's worth it. So those costs of the damage that was done to young athletes physically and mentally was considered worth it for the gains that were enjoyed. And now we know that's been toppled. Russia's been banned from the Olympics. The wall has come down in Eastern Bloc countries. But the costs remain, and there still is a predominant approach, doping approach for sure, in sport across the world. There's also this idea that, well, we'll tolerate abuse or abuse of power and privilege for the sake of achieving excellence. Here's Larry Nassar, and so many parents and coaches were discovered to have just swept him under the rug, even though they knew. And there's so many examples, Sandusky and Scott Thomas, of people sweeping things like this under the rug because we are lucky to be part of something, some privileged or prestigious program, or he's a prestigious doctor, and we can't question his authority. And that's a huge mistake. Again, it's leading to so many costs. As we can see, he abused over 500 young women, and their lives are irreparably damaged. This is a recent story. Dave Scott Thomas, he's a coach of a track at Guelph, and he has been recently banned. He's a bully, and he bullied a young woman into having sexual relations with him underage. He also bullied a number of other athletes and traumatized them in the process. But we accept it. We allow it. We tolerate bullying because we believe it gets us results. And so it's amazing the values compromises we've been making in sport for years and years. I think we're hitting a bit of a pitch point here where people are realizing that sport is in total need of cultural transformation and leadership development. And if we don't, the costs are going to be so significant that we will lose sport altogether. And it's interesting to watch the impact COVID has had on sport, that it really does risk sport will probably be one of the last things that is able to emerge from COVID because it does involve so much interaction, touching, contact. I don't see when, I don't really know when, even in a crew boat like this, it will be able to return anytime soon. And again, this is all reflected in the works of Hofstede and Shine around culture and leadership and collaboration, team learning, organizational learning. All of these wonderful writers and authors, theorists in this area are reflected in what we're experiencing in sport and vice versa. And I think sport has a lot to teach us in terms of in terms of the concepts of organizational leadership development, because it's a real experiment right now that we're able to pull back and learn from. As we know, culture, if we're looking at cultural change, culture shows up in terms of artifacts on the surface, things that we're communicating and enacting, structures, processes, systems, but really culture exists below the surface in terms of our values, beliefs, and assumptions. And if we don't get those right in a way that's sustainable for the environment, human beings, and organizations, communities, we're going to be in trouble. And we'll probably sink. Can we win without costs? This is the big question that this all challenged us to ask as researchers, and I'm part of a team of researchers. Some are former athletes for Canada, and others are colleagues at UVic, and it's been a wonderful team to work with, actually. Everybody brings so many different experiences and perspectives. But the question is, can we actually win without costs? Because if we go back to this idea of culture, we really need to shift the assumptions that are governing how we're behaving in the world of sport, and that, of course, transfers, I think, is quite parallel to the world of politics and organizations and communities. So can we shift that fundamental assumption that we must have costs if we're going to win? I do believe we do win when there are costs. We do win. Bullies win, abusers win. We've seen it countless times. Dopers win. The East Germans won on almost a clean sweep of gold medals in 1988. So it does win, but there are costs. So is it possible to win without costs, was our kind of fundamental research question. And we looked around and we realized, yeah, even within my own anecdotal experiences as an athlete, there are lots of examples of people winning without a great deal of cost, with a coach with integrity, with we're still intact. So this is my crew, and we're still rowing together. That's us just this past fall down at a race in Boston. This is Silken Laumann. She's an amazing leader. She's thriving. She managed to win that medal despite all sorts of adversity, and because of her ability to reach out to a team and lean on and be vulnerable. And rely on the support of others, right? We all had to do that as a group, and we know that there are tons of examples of that. Can we win better is the new question. Yes, we can definitely win without costs. We can win without bullying, without abuse, without being torn down and ripped apart and broken down. But we also believe, based on what we're learning from the number of leaders and athletes that we've interviewed and focus groups we've held and case studies we've conducted, that we can actually learn, we can win with benefits. And why wouldn't we want to do that? Sign me up. So we can we can win by developing empowered athletes who have a strong identity, who are ambassadors of sport, right? If we look at these kinds of benefits that actually not only benefit the athlete, but they benefit the community around the athlete. An athlete that's physically and mentally well, imagine, that has perspective and understands that they're no more important than anyone. They're not a celebrity. They're contributing to society by trying to put forth their best effort. They're modeling fair play, and they are developing their leadership competence by working within a team or as an individual athlete that then models good behaviors out into their communities. They contribute back. You look at so many examples even this past year where the men's rugby sevens was canceled and had to, they just couldn't finish their tournament, and they ended up contributing to some of the relief efforts where they were located in Hong Kong. So great examples of how we can develop athletes who aren't just athletes, but are also leaders in our society. sport offers such a wonderful environment to be developing these things. Why on earth would we sacrifice them or ignore them in order to just walk away with some kind of piece of shiny metal? And why on earth would we bother cheating or creating self-oriented or injured young people, young athletes, developing reputational harm for sport, hurting self-worth? Why would we bother enacting these kinds of costs on people when we don't need to, when we can win in these other wonderful ways without that, but also with more of a benefit associated with it? And so I like to frame, for coaches, I like to pose the question, can you win with benefits? Can you win and also develop leaders? Can you develop winners and leaders? So I try to coach coaches to think in those terms, that the real challenge isn't just to win, because actually you can win in all sorts of terrible ways. So it's not always such a great accomplishment. The athletes who doped aren't really winners, are they? Right? So challenging athletes and coaches to think differently about winning and what it means, but also challenging them not just to win, but to go beyond that and develop these amazing leaders. So we conducted a number of studies, starting with obviously a systematic review of the literature, but looking at current models of leadership development in sport, athlete development, sport performance, individual, team, and social development in different contexts, not just in sport, but in organizational learning. And also looking at a case study of that 92 Olympic team that won so many gold medals. And in the face of adversity, there was a lot of doping happening at that time. That was the time of Ben Johnson being sent home from the '88 Olympics, right? A number of interviews with Canadian and international sport leaders, that's high performance directors, CEOs, executive directors, coaches, but also interviews and focus groups with varsity and national team athletes of all different sports. And a review, of course, part of the literature review was looking at some of the work that's been done, especially in Canada, which is I'm quite proud of, through a number of different funding agencies, but by Sport Canada, by Canadian Association of Women in Sport, Athletes Can. There's so many organizations that are working separately but together to advance sport in Canada and to understand how to shift the culture, build the culture. A lot of this is coming motivated from the athletes themselves who don't want to lose the sport they love. The design of a model of personal and team leadership development for performance is what we were striving for. We don't think we need to sacrifice winning in order to save sport. And in fact, we don't think that would save sport. We need to win with integrity, win better. And so we were very interested in developing a development or a model of that kind of leadership in sport development. We know how culture works. We know that cultural integrity, so cultural integrity within sport would involve being very clear about our values, communicating those values by walking the talk through all of our systems, practices, processes, organizations, institutions, structures, etc. That alignment, congruity, coherence, that all brings energy, confidence, security, and performance. So we know that that actually contributes to performance. What are the values that are driving a very healthy sport system, though? So in our studies, we started with the case study of that high-performing team that really did surprise a lot of people with the outcomes that they were able to achieve. And we delved back into talking to all those athletes, those coaches, anybody associated with that kind of era of sport in Canada. And what we discovered, and it was reinforced again and again by the different interviews and focus groups we conducted, was that at the center of a high-performing sports system, and I think this is transferable probably to any organizational system, but is that it has to be about human and social development, not about winning, not about, on the podium. It's not about the podium. It's not about the medals. It needs to be about, at its fundamental, that core assumption, human and social development. This is then expressed through the athlete and coach values. It could start with the coach, but we found that coach's values actually were reinforced and kind of expanded and extended through the values that the athletes were expressing. It was beautiful. We know that this kind of coherence in those values expressed, so if we're all here for the sake of development of human beings and society, then that will show up in what we care about, what's important. It will show up in our practices, in our artifacts as well. And that should all be aligned. When it's aligned, we know we'll have integrity. That will lead to high performance, and that is what we were seeing. That these values and beliefs were showing up in terms of leadership attitudes and behaviors, but also the processes, structures, and systems that were at play. So clear visions, training plans that were accessible and available, that were well informed from a team of experts, coaches that relied on the experts. There was one story of a young coach who needed, he's trying to get his team to get that much faster. And he said, we need 10 seconds. I can accomplish 2. I need the other 8 seconds to come from his team of sports scientists. And he sat them down and explained this. And they all contributed to that shared purpose of trying to help this team get faster. Right? Some beautiful practices, transparent processes. So anything around selection was transparent, was accessible, was visible, didn't change suddenly. It wasn't up to the coach. It was built by many people, and again, informed by best practice. So we were seeing these things that, again, made a lot of sense in any organization, and were definitely linked to performance. So the other thing that we started to see emerge was this idea of it being a learning system, that in order to achieve high performance, this group was constantly thinking of themselves as a learning system. They were always learning from one another, but also learning from best practice from the sports scientists and staff. And so just like Tuckman's model of, any kind of team learning phases, you come together, you learn and storm. He calls it storming. We called it learning about diversity and roles. We formed those into norms, and then those became part of our performing phases. Eventually, the team transitions and adjourns, right? So we saw a real evidence of these kind of concepts emerging as well as integral to high performance and a cohesive, healthy system of athletes, coaches, and staff. And it made me think of this wonderful quote by Richie McCaw, that a team of rugby players is usually 15 in that kind of game, 15 aside. And he says, he's a captain. He's this guy right here in the center. A rugby team is 1 captain and 15 leaders. And I love this because it illustrates what we were seeing, this idea that one of the strongest principles that was coming through was this idea of equality, that people and equity. People were no one was privileged, no coach, no CEO, no high performance director, no athlete was above anybody else. There was this shared leadership model. And yes, there's a coach, and yes, the coach gives direction, just like a captain might on a team, but everybody is the leader. Everybody is a leader on that team. A captainship or a coach role or a high performance director is a role. And there are a number of responsibilities that are accompany that role, but it doesn't make them any more important than the responsibilities of the athlete or a staff person, because all of those responsibilities are essential in achieving performance. Now imagine if we applied that in an organizational setting. Another model that emerged was this idea of centricity. What's at the center? So this idea that we talked about earlier around the fundamental assumption governing a system or a culture in a system has to be something that will then guide how people operate. So the problem in sport right now is our fundamental assumption is we can only win with a lot of costs associated. We can only win by breaking people down and destroying things, or risking compromising values, cheating, hurting people. But of course, when we called that into question and said, well, what should be at the center? Winning with benefits. Winning is about development. Sport is about development. Sorry, not winning. Sport is about development and performance, of course, but also development. And the two are inextricably linked. So if we put that at the center, that governs everything very differently. It doesn't tolerate abuse. It doesn't privilege someone over someone else like Larry Nassar. It doesn't allow for bullying. It doesn't allow for doping and cheating. Because development insists that we have integrity and that we're society-centric. So now we're developing coaches and leaders where as if we put medals at the center, we're typically creating celebrities. You see coaches even kind of nudge up onto the podium trying to gain some of the glory and fame with their athlete when it becomes all about the medals and the trophies. It can't be coach-centric. It can't be all about, oh, I need the coach, and that coach is a remarkable human being that is all responsible for our performance. That only develops narcissists. It all becomes about the coach. It creates athletes that are dependent on coaches. It can't be about the athlete either. And I know I get some pushback on this. It can be about their development, but it can't be about the athlete themselves. We end up developing prima donnas who, yes, they have maybe high development because it's all about them, but they end up having low performance because their focus is in the wrong place. In order to have both high performance and high development as human beings, you need more of a leader, sport-centric, developmental model that governs people to behave in that collaborative manner where everybody's contributing to a shared purpose and no one's more kind of dominant over another. The other thing that emerged really strongly was this idea that power balance is crucial. When we get into a situation where we have imbalance in power, then we see the Larry Nassars emerge. We actually open the door to these kind of people. We've seen lots of cases at universities across Canada where we have these bullies, and they're men, they're women, they're in different sports, but it's all about the power imbalance. And I really think the more we explore that issue, the more we realize when we create a system where there is power imbalance, we actually invite everyone to behave terribly. The athletes end up behaving terribly because they're afraid to say anything and to call anything into question. They're so afraid for their position or role. It makes parents behave terribly, like we saw with Larry Nassar, where they just accepted and deferred to someone in a position of authority and power. We see people sweeping things under the rug or turning a blind eye to really questionable behavior because they just want those results, or they're afraid they won't get the results, and all their funding hinges on that. So it's just this terrible spiral. If we close the door to that kind of power imbalance, and we only invite people who are willing to participate in a collaborative system and process and structure, we end up inviting beautiful behavior, values, attitudes. People are all sharing in their purposeful performance focus. It's incredible. One last thing that we then were striving to do was to enhance what we have right now in Canada, which is this long-term athlete development model. And what it tends to focus on is, much like in our organizations, it thinks about the bottom line, the physical, the mental, and sort of operational or management. We call it skills, but I thought management kind of relates its nutrition and sleep and recovery. But there's something missing there. We're not really thinking about the human opportunities here for development as much as the physical, yes, but you start to feel like an automaton. Yes, the mental, it's all about your ability to focus and be disciplined and endure, and then this ability to manage yourself. But where's the other piece of that leadership development, the moral, the character, the community perspective, and giving back contributions to society? Think of athletes like Adam Van Koeverden, amazing world champion, Olympic gold medalist, and now he's leading as a politician at Milton. Tricia Smith, she leads the COC. She was a world champion in rowing. We've got Clara Hughes, Haley Wickenheiser's doing great things right now. Like that kind of leadership development is what we were looking for. And we think it's really the answer to avoiding and shifting the culture around winning in our sports system right now to something that's about winning with benefits, winning better, winning in a way that has integrity and is developing not just the athlete, but also society and contributing to society. And we believe that in doing that, we're going to get true sport, good sport, quality sport that will have the power to develop society, develop countries, develop young people. And in that way, we're going to rescue the reputation of sport as well. Rescue it because I worry it's going to get lost, but also take advantage of sport more effectively so that we're actually leveraging it as a tool of education, right? In our society, it's a contributor, it could be. And these young athletes could be developing into such amazing contributors in society, as we've seen some great examples of that, but it'd be wonderful to see it more intentionally developed. So we're recommending that we add a whole other stream of education for athletes, that coaches be trained in this kind of development as well. Their own development, the development of those they're working with within the system, staffs, we're scientists, leaders, but also the athletes, of course, are developing their leadership skill. And I'm quite thrilled to be a part of new initiatives with On the Podium in an effort to shift the focus so that it isn't about medals, but it's more about excellence, building a culture of excellence. And more of about performance instead of podiums, development instead of grinding people down, and they're the leaders within On the Podium are developing all sorts of initiatives, coach enhancement programs for the leadership development for their sports scientists, and I think next is really the athlete development. But there are lots of organizations working on athlete development as well, including Royal Roads. So one of the main points, too, of all of this research was to then link it back into the cultural and leadership development within organizations. So what can organizational leaders take from this? And I work with lots of organizations now and definitely increasingly use the sport metaphor, but I also share the research that we're doing here around sport and teasing out these principles that I think are really helpful for leaders in organizations. One of the main things that came out was this idea of the values-based leadership, that there be a verb, not a noun, at the center. Now, it's not entirely true because development is also a noun, but this idea of learning being at the center, developing being at the center, instead of an athlete or a coach or a medal. This idea that collaboration is crucial, that we're a team, and so bringing that from sport and into organization, the team of teams model where everybody is always functioning as part of a team. You're contributing, importantly, you have a role to play and responsibilities to uphold, but we all have responsibilities, and everybody's essential. And like I say, there's a captain and 15 leaders. We're all leaders in our own way. And to move away from this hierarchical model that is so dangerous because it creates a power imbalance. People struggle with this because, well, how do we do things? How do we get things done without that command and control model? But it is absolutely possible when we have something at the center that's governing us, that we all have a shared purpose and a driving force that is really clear, like human and social development. It's amazing how it then shows up in decision-making structures, systems, processes. Part of the non-hierarchy that I've found has been helpful is this idea of an athlete-coach relationship, and we call it a fractal, that shows up right across an organization. So if we look at a sport organization, we definitely have a coach who's coaching the athlete, but the coach is also an athlete in many ways, being coached by their performance director and their sports scientists that sit around them as part of their performance team. The high performance director is a coach, coaching the coaches, but is also coached by their CEO. The CEO is coached by the board. Everybody's in both of those roles as athlete and coach all the way across an organization. And I really don't think it gets more complex than that. If you can remember that we're always playing both of those roles, I think it helps people stay humble, actually, and equitable. This idea that everybody's constantly learning, everything is about learning and developing. So curiosity being at the center of all that we do. It's not just about the athlete's development, but also about the system's development and the leader's development, the coach's development. We're all developing together because we're in the business of learning. I think this links beautifully to our own institution, right? That learning has to be at the center, and it will govern all of us. But we are all learners, not just the students. Eh? Communication, crucial. I'm biased, of course. I work in the School of Communication, but the systems, mechanisms, processes, and forums have to be there in order to enable the collaboration, in order to enable the learning, in order to enable that athlete-coach relationship, and enable it to function in a way where people are constantly being supported in their development. And along with that, of course, comes clarity of purpose and planning. Leaning on those communication systems, you can then have greater clarity of process and procedure and clarity of responsibilities and roles. And that takes a lot of work, but it is worth it. In the end, you're going to end up, once you have those foundations in place, driven from a very sustainable, humanly, environmentally, and societally sustainable set of core assumptions and values, you're going to end up generating a structure, an organizational structure and system that is very supportive and sustainable in its own right, and high performing ultimately. So we've seen this in small cases with teams. We've seen it across the world now, and hearing it from all kinds of leaders across the sports system. And then from the athletes themselves, they're linking these kinds of organizational concepts to their performance, and they actually surface it as something invisible often or not counted. It doesn't show up on the stat sheet, but equally as important as any kind of physical or mental training they might be doing. And I think that just really bodes well for the work we do at Royal Roads. I think we are doing and teaching a lot of these concepts already. I see it in the School of Leadership and Environment and Business and Communication. I mean, it's everywhere. We embody these principles within our model of ACT, or Applied and Authentic, caring and community-based and transformational. These are all the similar processes and concepts to what we're discovering through our exploration of sport. So I want to thank you all for coming, and then we're going to open it up to questions now. So I'm going to just turn that off. Thanks, Pedro.
Okay, thank you so much, Jennifer. It was really lovely to be able to do that and to see so many people here. I always love hearing about your research.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing it, and thank you to everyone for taking time to attend. So I'm going to end the recording there.